Happy Easter, Christ is risen. Oh, it's really amazing that we can be together, at least in this way, although I do wish I was on Holy Island right now, on the beach or in the priory, by the priory or Aiden's statue, having just given out lots of hugs or had communion or something like that. But anyway, here we are in this here and now. I tried lots of ways and places to give this talk. I went to Cuthbert's Cave. I went to Dancing Green Hill, which isn't far away, where you can see out over the Cheviots and both Lindisfarne Castle and Bamborough Castle. And I went to Holy Island and stood at the causeway as the tide was coming in. And for various technical reasons, none of the recording worked in those places. But here I am in my house, and you're probably listening to this in your house. And I thought, actually, instead of trying to get out to one of our special places, part of what we've been learning is the special place of our homes. So here I am in my home, from my home to yours, from my heart to yours, wishing you a happy Easter. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but I get really into stories, like if I'm watching a film or reading a book, and if I'm at a good spot and I have to stop, I find it really frustrating because then I'm going, but what's going to happen next? And there's all these people in the midst of something, and how's the story going to end? And then the satisfaction when the story ends well, and I feel like I can let all the characters go for a little while. It's amazing on a day like today, because I feel like most of real life is Easter Saturday, Holy Saturday rather, where you're in between things and you think you know that the story's ended, and yet there's something more to come. And today it's certainly not the end of the story, but it's celebrating the resolution of one part of a story where we think we knew, the disciples knew, this was an ending. And yet, miraculously, amazingly, the story takes a turn. A great turn, a surprising turn. And we find out it's not the end, but a beginning. And it got me thinking, I have a friend who said to me that he feels like at the heart of it, the Holy Bible is a book about the story of God speaking to a people over time, which is one way to look at it. And in that way, in a way, as a community, we also have our own community Bible, if you like, which is the story of how God has spoken to us over time, as well as perhaps having our own personal Bibles. Perhaps in our journal, we're writing the ways that God has revealed God's self to us, or given us a word, or guided us, or the story is turned in ways we didn't expect. But just this week, I've been remembering one of, not only, of course, the Easter story and the Aeta story, but a story that does not happen to me directly, but I've borne witness to in our community's time. Not long ago, online, I attended the funeral of Brian Scrivener of the monastery, one of the founders of monastery of St. Barnabas the Encourager. And I was finding myself drawn back into a story that has just amazed me. So I lived and really learned the monastic life from Rob and Joanna Brown at Hetton Hall from 2005 to kind of 2009 in that time. It's not the only people I learned the monastic way from, but they were two of my great teachers and examples. But they knew that their time living at the mother house was coming to an end. They knew Hetton Hall as the mother house was, the lease was up, and they didn't feel called to take the journey to the next spot. Rob and Joanna, such beautiful, faithful people. But they knew something was ended. They had practically no money. They have no children, no adult children to support them. The monastic life is great, but it's not like a CV item, and it's not on their resume, and they weren't kind of looking to go back into normal work. They wanted to continue this way of life. But what were they going to do? They had put themselves entirely in God's care and were in a season of listening and of waiting. Meantime, so I was watching this and thinking, my goodness, what amazing people, what ways of faith, what will happen. In the meantime, two other people from the house team at the time, Martin and Becca. Becca was on retreat near her parents' house, went to a place she'd never been before. And she thought the retreat, as you might have thought, was going to be about her and her time with God. But it ended up being about something else. Because the first day, her retreat guide said, you know, I'm getting older, my husband's getting older, and this monastery where we live, we're needing to pass it on. Do you know of anybody that might be looking to live in a monastery? And she, of course, was thinking about Rob and Joanna, but she didn't say it straight away. And actually, the whole place reminded her of them. But she kept it to herself. And every day of this retreat, the retreat leader, Dorothy, got more and more insistent, like, are you sure that this doesn't remind you of anyone? And then she started revealing what God had revealed to her and her husband, which was all about who they felt like God was going to send. And it was a married couple without children of this particular age with experience of the monastic life that would appreciate the setting and the way the life was there, all of this. And it just became clear as day that this was Rob and Joanna that God had put on Dorothy and Brian's heart. So Martin and Becca invited Rob and Joanna over for dinner. And it was a little bit, they knew it was a thing. And Joanna thought that Martin was going to invite her to come on a trip to Africa with him. And she was kind of like, oh, I'm not sure if I want to go back to Africa. It was all Africa. I'm not sure about what I'll say if they ask me this. And instead of that question, of course, it was, would you like to have a monastery? And they brought a picture book with them with pictures of the monastery of St. Barnabas the Encourager. And I wasn't there that night, but I was living at Hetton at the time and saw the reverberations happening of this question and this opportunity and this turn and this story. This year, I should say, Rob and Joanna visited once, and they visited a second time. And the second time, Brian said to Joanna, are you home then? And she said, that'll do. And now for many years, they moved from Hetton to Bryn Mawr on the border in Wales. And that's where they make their home. And this year, both Dorothy and Brian have died. And they have died well. They've died with honor. They've died as much as possible in these times with the care and love and prayers of their friends and their family and those that they have so lovingly listened to and journeyed with over these years. And in the eulogies of both services, Rob and Joanna have been deeply honored for the role that they've played. They were the answer to Dorothy and Brian's prayers, and they both died knowing that the monastery that they founded and created had been passed on. And now Rob and Joanna, who had no money and no place that they owned and all of this, have a monastery and a home and a monastic life to continue to live and to be sustained by. To make the story more interesting, Martin and Becca, meantime, had been praying about a home for themselves. And praying, and we were praying alongside of them. They've been in the prayer guide. You might have known this as well. They're called to the nations, but they needed a home base. And goodness, visiting Becca's parents and then visiting Rob and Joanna, they met friends of Rob and Joanna who caught a vision of who Martin and Becca were. And those people had resources and offered Martin and Becca home, which in this last year they have moved into just down the road from Rob and Joanna. And since that time, that original couple has been joined by one other couple, And they're Americans who've just felt called to Wales and to the deep wells of Wales and left their home and left everything and followed this call. And God has brought the 8 of them together. And they're dreaming about this hall of music and the monastery of St. Barnabas and who God might send their way and what songs they might be singing and what prayers they might be praying as they sing the Lord's song in a strange land in that place. And my goodness, you just think, I don't know, it's like Martin said to me, well, Catherine, you just put one foot in front of the other in faith, and then you look behind you at all that's happened and you laugh because God has done something more marvelous and surprising than you ever dared believe. I love it in Frederick Buechner's Peculiar Treasures, where he's talking about the story of Abraham and Sarah and their great laughter when the birth of Isaac is announced. And he says they laughed because they realized that the wildest dreams they had dared believe weren't half wild enough. And today, on this Easter day, I kind of think that's what Mary must have been thinking as she heard not the gardener, but her Lord and Savior call her name. That's what Peter and John must have been what Thomas was thinking when he put his hands in the side of the resurrected Jesus, to think, well, however surprised we knew to be following this man around for the last 3 years, we've realized we haven't dreamed big enough. The reign of God is even bigger, is even more powerful and surprising and wonderful than we'd even dared to believe. And I'm amazed by the stories of the Israelites, and I so often relate to them. And in particular, they've been rescued from slavery. They've been chased by this army. The Red Sea has parted. They've come through into freedom, and they end up in the wilderness. And it doesn't take long before they're complaining. They just think, like, God must hate us. Let's try a different God and see if that works out better for us. Whinging and all of this. And when you're reading the story, you think, it's just like 2 chapters ago that all of these miracles had happened. All this provision had happened where God just showed up and showed power and showed love in such an amazing way. Have you already forgotten? Of course, I have the benefit of just flipping through the pages of a book and reading about it. But when you're in real time, and I know in my own life, it doesn't take many months into lockdown where I'm just like that, like, this will never end. God mustn't like me, or else this wouldn't be so hard, or what will become of us? And though I'm not tempted to build any, worship any golden calves, golden cows, I think, maybe, online shopping will work. Maybe that's like a thing that will make me feel better, or the biscuit tin, or the wine bottle, or you could just keep going of ways that we keep trying to distract or escape or numb things. But all the time, you just think of my own life. It was just a chapter or 2 ago when I was singing God's praises. How have I forgotten that so quickly? Part of what we do for each other, I think, is help us remember our own stories, to help us remember the bigger stories of what God is doing, so that in the here and now, we can somehow turn our hearts to hope and faith and life, to remember that we're not done with our stories yet. I love it in the Brendan liturgy when it says, "Oh God, I will believe you for my future, chapter by chapter, till all the story is written." And so often we're just in the middle of the story, which can be very frustrating, and you can't quite see how things are going to go, but it's important to hang on in there in the middle of the story. And days like today, days when we remember just how powerful and beautiful and surprising it is to follow this man, this risen one, Jesus, and how amazing it is to be part of his body when we're told we're going to do even greater things than he did. And we know the story's not done yet. Days like today, I think we can lean into that and remember it more. Recently, I've been rereading the Wingfeather Saga by Andrew Peterson, and it's 4 books, fairly long, and I finally got to the end of the 4th book the other day when I was on Dancing Green Hill, actually, and when I got to the end of that story, I felt like one of those moments which happens in good stories when your imagination is really caught up in the truest things, I think. And you can see that the things that you really most deeply hope are true, probably, most likely, nearly 100% are true. And I felt this way as I got to this poem right at the end of the book. I've adapted a little bit for this talk, but it says, "The world is whispering, listen. The world is telling a tale. When the sea foam froths in the water wild, or the eagle flies in the gale. When the sky is mad with the swirling storm and the thunder shakes the hall, child, keep watch for the passing form of the one who made it all. The dark of the heart is a darkness deep, and the sweep of the night is wide, and the pain of the heart when the people weep is an overwhelming tide. And yet, when the tide runs low, as the tide will always do, and the heavy sky where the bellows blow is bright at last and blue, and the sun ascends in the quiet morn, and the sorrow sinks away, when the veil of death is dark and torn asunder by the day. Then the light of love is the flame of spring, and the flow of the river strong, and the hope of the heart as the people sing in an everlasting song. The winter is whispering green and gold, and the heart is whispering too. It's a story the Maker has always told, and the story, my dear, is true." We read in our Celtic Daily Prayer Book 2 meditations that we have to be candles burning between hope and despair, faith and doubt, life and death, all of the opposites. I think that's true, and that's how I live most days of my life. But on this day, I think just to have practice and to put my weight on the foot of hope, of faith and life, and to kind of woo myself, let myself lean into the hope, the belief that the stories are true, that the story of Jesus' resurrection isn't wishful thinking on behalf of the disciples. I think if it wasn't real, we wouldn't have seen this enormous change in them from cowering, scared, fearful men and women to bold women and men who were willing to give their lives for their faith. In the story of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when Aslan is put to death, it is through the deep magic that this has to happen, or that this happens. But when he comes back, it's through the deeper magic. And I relate to that so much. I think about there's a deep reality in our world, a reality of systemic racism, of a global health crisis, of a planet ecological crisis, and lots of other things. None of our futures is guaranteed. We will all are going to die. There is a deep magic that we cannot undo, or a deep reality that we cannot ignore. I think that's a better way to say it. A deep reality that is reality. The only way that God will change things is through going through it, going through that reality. And I would never say, for example, to Jesus after the cross, like, "Oh, it's all right, love. It all turned out fine in the end. That was fine, wasn't it?" Or trying to skip that bit. It was only through that bit, which itself had enormous pain. And for our own experiences, the hard things are hard. The painful things are painful. The injustices are unjust. And they are all true, and they are all real, and they have their own laws of how it works and consequences of actions and belief systems. But it's really important on a day like today and in a year like we're having to remember there are deeper realities at work as well. And that is not fairy tales, although I do love Narnia and I do talk about it a lot. I think the power of Narnia is pointing to something true. Jesus told stories and spoke in parables. And in a way, we have the story of his resurrection as in a way like in a storybook. But it is so transformational to live everyday life, even if you can't quite believe, as best as you can, believing that maybe this is real. And whatever part of the story of your own life you're in right now, just around the corner, there might be a turn. And if you could pull the veil back between dimensions, you would see something much deeper and bigger at work. When we think about our own Saint Eata, if the story of the Celtic saints of Northumbria were like in the Oscars, he would only be up for Best Supporting Actor ever, he might have gotten an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. It's felt really good to me and to have a whole focus on somebody that isn't the hero of the story or the main character, but goodness, he was there for all of it. And without him, the story wouldn't have worked out the way it did. And it's reminded me again about how each of us have a part to play. Each of us can collaborate. Each of us can bear witness to things. And, our own choices and actions of faithfulness, they bear fruit, don't they? They impact the whole story. And the story of Rob and Joanna, Becca is a supporting character. She was there to give a message, there at the right place at the right time. But later, Rob and Joanna became supporting characters in the story of Becca and Martin, who needed a home, and it was through them that they made an introduction that made a new home for them possible. It strikes me that Eata was faithful to his part of the story. He went to the places he was called to go, to Lindisfarne, to Melrose, to Ripon, to Hexham. He was there at the Synod of Whitby. He was faithful to collaborate with the people that he was sent to work with Aidan, with Boisel, with Cuthbert, with Hilda, with Wilfred. He was serving God in the here and now of his own life, in the midst of plague, in the midst of spiritual upheaval, in the midst of political upheaval, in the midst of his own illness. He was there, and he is described by Bede, we hear, as the gentlest and simplest of men in the midst of all of that. And so in our Eata liturgy, we have as the very last line, which knocks my socks off every time, this call: let us embody your ready kindness in our day, for things will not be as they were before. Let us embody your ready kindness in our day, for things will not be as they were before. I think we could do worse than having this hope for ourselves as Easter people, that we might embody kindness. And like with our rule of life, what our bodies are doing, where our bodies are, what our contexts are, even in our days, what kindness looks like. All of that is not prescriptive, and it's not a done deal. You don't just figure that out once. You have to keep figuring out, what does it mean for me to embody a ready kindness for others in my time? Because whatever worked before, or however life was before, it might not be the same. In fact, we can be guaranteed of that. We're moving forward into a new future. So how might we embody kindness? And I do love that Jesus chose to take on a body. Somehow in his coming down, he's lifted up our experience of being human. And then by going through death and coming out the other side of it and showing us this new body, which is, you could recognize him and then not recognize him, or not recognize him and then he says your name, or he does an action and you recognize him. You can touch him. You can even touch his wounds are still there, and yet he can walk through doors. He can speak these words of peace that suddenly all of your fear, when he can come and speak peace. By his resurrection life and showing us what that looks like, it also, I think, lifts us forward in hope toward what's coming for us, because these particular bodies, wonderful though they are, aren't the end. But I think the best we can do in our own embodiment, to show up, use our own voice to speak peace, to bring our own little candles burning between things into the places and to the people that we're called to be with. To figure out and take the time to say, what does kindness look like in my situation, in my home, in my neighborhood, in my workplace, as a citizen of the world? What does it look like to be kind? And might we be ready to embody kindness in our day? Jesus has gone before us to show us what embodying a ready kindness looks like. He's gone before us to show us, I think, that there's more beauty and power and good surprises at work in the world than we ever dared allow ourselves to imagine. And ultimately, I think, he's the author and perfecter of our faith. It's him that we can trust as the story of our own lives continue to be written. Happy Easter, my dear friends, and I wish you all the best as you continue to celebrate in this time.